Welcome back to the Heroes Gallery, where I give a little bit of love to some of the less talked about characters in Warhammer Tacticus. This time we're taking a look at Ulf from the Space Wolves and Aesoth from the Custodes, which was a recommendation from the comments. So if there's a character that I haven't reviewed yet that you want me to take a look at, leave a comment down below. I do read it, and it can make it into a video. As always, there are 4 categories we take a look at. The performance in the more competitive modes of the game, so this is Guild Raids, Guild Wars, the performance in Horde Modes, which for me also includes campaigns and campaign events, and lastly a subjective but very important fun category. So moving into looking at Ulf first of all, Ulf is, I'd say, a bit more on the offensive side than the defensive. His defensive stats are pretty average, comparing him to the... I've got the averages on the right-hand side. But his damage output is really quite strong compared to other characters. So he's not all that defensively vulnerable, but his damage output is really quite nice. His abilities are quite interesting. So his active is the Great Frost Axe. He gives a swing in with his big axe. He does a decent amount of damage, and then he applies ice to both the hex that the target's on and then surrounding hexes as well. I'll talk about ice in a moment if you don't know how it functions. His passive is quite interesting when it mostly focuses, there's sort of 2 halves to it. So the first is to do with summons. So if summons either move next to Ulf or are summoned next to Ulf, he does quite a lot of damage to them. The damage scaling of this is such that for like levels, he typically takes out comparably leveled summons to his ability. I have on more than one occasion forgotten about this passive, messed up, and say use my my Archie active on him, and he's just killed all of the summons, and it's very sad. What I think is interesting on the half of this that's I think a little bit forgotten about is that when enemies use their active abilities whilst next to Ulf, he gets to do the same thing. He gets to use his attack against them. This is actually, I think, really quite interesting and is something we can talk about in terms of his usability. So his traits, he's got Unstoppable. He isn't stopped by things like barbed wire, fire, other hexes that would stop people, and he's got Final Vengeance. So as he's going down, when you reduce him to 0, if it wasn't an overkill, he gets in one final attack. So the Ice Hex, for anyone that doesn't know, the Ice Hex will stop movement, obviously unless you're flying or unstoppable or a vehicle, the usual exceptions to movement effects. And anyone on an Ice Hex is vulnerable to an extra 25% crit damage. This is actually really quite a lot, so crits are going to do more to somebody that's on an Ice Hex. How's Ulf going to function in different game modes? Well, in raids, I think he's actually... I'll be honest, when I was first putting this together, I was prepared to give Ulf a really low score. But as I thought about him, I think he's a bit better than you might think. So the obvious use here is against summon-heavy bosses or primes. Who would fall into that category? Well, obviously the likes of Gazkul, Avatar, Sasaric, Corodius. This is one of the... Mortarian's primes. Most of the NIDs have a lot of the NIDs have summoning abilities as well. Weirdly, Magnus or the Magnus kind of adjacent primes, their clones don't count as summons, which I've always found very frustrating. Snowprint, please change that. It's really frustrating. That being said, Ulf is only going to work against summons who attack in melee. So someone like Sasaric, the Silent King, his summons typically attack from range, so they're not going to get close enough to Ulf for Ulf's passive to activate. And as well, I think sort of in the negative column here, you can always just use Forge Fiend to deal with the summons of summon heavy bosses. If you're against somebody like Call, for instance, I always recommend bringing Forge Feed against Call, because you're going to be able to just delete Call summons at the bottom of the map. What you would have to do with Ulf is move Ulf down to deal with these summons, and that's not as practical as just using Forge Fiend. So all of that might be teeing up for me to say that Ulf's not very good in raids, that he's going to get a really bad grade, because why would you not just use Forge Fiend? Doesn't Forge Fiend just do the anti-summon role but better? Well, whilst I think that's partly the case, I want to remember back to the other part of his passive. The Ulf also does extra attacks when adjacent units use active abilities. Well, there's lots of bosses that do multiple actives per turn. Such bosses are going to get multiple activations of Ulf's passive if he's next to them. So maybe there's some space here. Maybe there's some space for using Ulf against bosses that maybe they have some summons, but that they've also got, they use lots of actives as well. The obvious one that I considered here was maybe against some of the Tyrannid bosses. There's a little bit of use here. They tend to stay in one place, so Ulf's going to be reliably next to them. They have multiple actives, so Ulf's going to get lots of activations, and they often have summons as well, so he's going to be able to use his passive there as well. Now, all that being said, don't get me wrong, this is marginal use. I don't think he's entering the meta anytime soon. But I think there's just a little bit more use there than you maybe think at first glance. If you happen to have him leveled, if you really like him because you're a huge Space Wolves fan, maybe he's a good rotation against some of these options, either bosses that are going to stay in one place, or you can pin them in place, that have lots of active abilities that they use per turn, and that are summoning as well. If they're satisfying all those conditions, then perhaps Ulf's an interesting kind of offbeat choice here. I've given him a C+. He's definitely not in any top teams, but there was more use than I thought for him when I first started thinking about this. Okay, moving on to Guild War. I find that Ulf is reasonably useful on attack. He's definitely not a top tier character here, but he's definitely not bad, especially if your opponent's using a very summon heavy lineup on defense, which can sometimes be a little bit tricky to deal with. Having Ulf in the mix basically just negates that team. Alternatively, you can use him quite strategically to disrupt particularly powerful actives. I don't know, maybe they're running, say, Ragnar, and you're worried about a Howl next turn. Get Ulf in right next to Ragnar. If he howls, you're going to be able to get that attack off first, and if you kill him, you stop the active from happening. On defense, I find he's not that useful. The reason for this is that all of his whole kit can just be played around by a player. So if you see Ulf on the enemy team, you just don't bring summoners, and you don't stand next to him and use an active, so play around him. He's very easy to play around when you're attacking against him, so he's not a strong recommendation for defense, but I think he is pretty useful on offense if you use him against the right teams in the right way. I've given him a C+ as well for this. As I say, he's not top tier, he's not carrying, but he's pretty useful contextually, especially on attack. Moving on to Horde Modes, to be honest, he's just really not that useful here. There aren't typically summons in Horde Modes. The exception to this, that if I don't mention, somebody is going to mention in the comments, is the Cadian Voxcasters. It is true, these do summon, and they are often in Horde mode, so LREs and in a few of the campaigns, but then they're never in a context where you could use Ulf against them. So for instance, typically Voxcasters would appear as enemies in an LRE track where it's no Imperials, and then you couldn't use Ulf. As well, the fact that Ulf has, say, relatively high damage stats, or that he's able to do these sort of to active abilities, these big attacks, it's just not that relevant against Hordes, and the fact that he doesn't have much crowd control, I think really takes away his value in Horde mode. So I've actually given him an E in Horde mode. I think his performance is that poor in this format. This is the first E I've given out. Maybe I'm being a little bit harsh here. I don't know. You can tell me in the comments if you think I should promote him to a D or to maybe a little bit better. But I don't recommend him for Horde modes. For fun, I think he's great fun. He's a big wolf boy with an axe. What's more to like than that? I've said before, I really like characters with these reactive attacks. They're good fun, and especially watching loads of summons come in and just killing them one after the other. It is really satisfying. He is a good fun character, so I've given him B. So how to improve Ulf? I think as you can see from the grades I've given him, I see Ulf as quite an underperforming character at the moment. I would like to see him, in particular, I think making him more raid focused would be a good idea. How would we do this? Well, the goal here, I'm not trying to buff up Ulf so much that he becomes a top meta pick. I want to be quite focused here and say that the bosses where his kit naturally performs well against, so static bosses with lots of actives and with summons, let's make him a competitive choice there, but maybe a competitive alternate rather than a kind of offbeat choice. Not necessarily top meta. How are we going to do this? Well, first of all, I think we could move his hits up to 4 hits rather than the current 3. You can adjust the damage accordingly. This means that he fits a little bit more naturally into a kind of offbeat multi-hit team, just because his damage can be buffed a little bit more. I think in getting kind of more concrete here, I could see Ulf working in a kind of critical buff role. So first of all, I think it would be nice to give the Space Wolves in general a faction trait where there's a chance to apply ice. Now, because ice lasts for 2 turns, you actually need to set the chance of this, I think, relatively low, especially because it's a comparatively dangerous hex effect. So I'd say perhaps give Space Wolves a passive 20% chance to apply ice, and then give them a relic that's going to bump that to 40% instead. I'd like to rework his active in particular. I think that would make Ulf a lot more competitive. So it's going to be the same idea, I think, a big attack. I'm going to take away the auto ice. The reason for this is I've already kind of included that to some extent in the Space Wolves, this faction trait I've suggested. Also, if Ulf is getting lots of attacks via his passive, that 20% or 40% is going to be applying over and over again. If he's used in the right context and he's getting lots of passive activations, then you're going to reliably have ice down. So no auto ice. I think that gives us some space to make his active stronger. It puts the skill floor a little bit higher, but the skill ceiling higher as well. The big change I'd like to his active, though, is that once he uses it on an enemy, for the rest of the turn, the crit chance of attacks against that target increases by, a not insignificant amount. So the idea is you'd maybe use him with Ragnar here, whose Howl gives a buff to crit damage as well. So you Howl, you charge in with Ulf and use Ulf's active. Okay, if we're using Ulf properly, there's already ice on the floor, so we've got a 25% buff to crit damage. Ulf's axe comes in, now we've got a buff to crit chance as well, and you've now got a really high likelihood of critting with a really good crit damage buff from Howl and from Ice. I think all of that together could, make Ulf play this interesting role of trying to constantly apply ice through lots of attacks, having an active that boosts crit chance, so he has this kind of critical buff role in certain teams. If you're enjoying the video so far, thank you so much for watching. Give the video a like, do subscribe if you want to see more from the Heroes Gallery or any of my other content such as my Guild Raids 101. As always, thanks everyone for watching, it really does mean a lot. So moving on to Aesoth. Aesoth is a defensively very strong character. So Aesoth's health is well above the average, as is his armor as well. His damage output is a notable amount lower than the average, but it's not so low. So he's not completely useless offensively, but he is really a defensive character. That's where he shines. His active effect is Vexilla Magnifica. So this is actually the name for the standard he carries. What it means is when he uses the active, he deals some damage, both to potentially to a couple of targets. There's a little bit of crowd control, but what's really nice is that it applies the stun effect as well, and then Aesoth gets a not insignificant damage reduction for a round. What's really nice as well is this has a cooldown of 2 rounds, so you can use this potentially multiple times, especially in something like Guild Wars where there are often more drawn out fights. What I really like about Aesoth though is his passive ability, Stand Vigil. So Aesoth effectively gives a defensive buff to everyone nearby. So normally just to adjacent units, there's an armor buff, and a damage buff to non-normal attacks. This is pretty standard for the Custodes kit. What's nice as well, again pretty standard for Custodes, if any Custodes has used an active ability this turn, the Stand Vigil radius goes from 1 hex to 2 hexes. So if you learn to offset your Custodes abilities, you can have this as a 2 hex radius pretty much constantly. In terms of the traits, he's got the Martial Cathar trait, which is the faction trait for Custodes. This is a bit of a damage buff against summons, which isn't as relevant, but the more interesting thing is that there's a damage reduction against normal attacks. So if you combine the damage reduction from Martial Cathar with, especially sometimes the damage reduction from Aesoth's active, with his already very competitive defensive stats to begin with, overall you get a really tough character that can be hard to kill. Next is the big target trait as well, and resilience. So the first time that Aesoth goes down to 0 health unless overkilled, he only goes down to 1 health instead. Okay, can Aesoth work in guild raids? Generally, no, he's not a top pick here, but I think he's a reasonable kind of emergency Custodes substitute, especially if you're punching up with Custodes, so you don't have a top raid team. You're still building your raid team up and you just need a bit more survivability. Then actually rotating him in maybe into the 5th Custodes slot is definitely an option here. Just adding a little bit of survivability to your Custodes, as well as buffing the non-normal attacks from especially from Carrion and say from Khan if you're using him as well. Sadly, the stun effect doesn't work against bosses, which is I think one of the nicer parts of Aesoth's kit. But I still think there's enough there that he's definitely, I don't think he's in the meta, but there's more to say to him than for him than you might think. He's not a bad kind of emergency substitute for Custodes if you need someone. I've given him a B- for this. So I think he is not a bad substitute in the Custodes context. Definitely not the top team, but not a bad alternate. Okay, moving on to Guild War. Again, I think not a top choice here, but he is a reliable pick both on offense and defense. His stuns are great on offense, especially if you know how to use them well. War, can turn into a little bit of a slug sometimes. His defensive buffs are really nice here. His passive just in general is really useful. I've given him a B for Guild War. Something I'll add on here as well, I think when you use him on defense, he's the kind of character that the computer knows how to use well, and knows how to get a decent amount out of. So I do think he's a safe choice on defense. Definitely not a top pick, but he's reasonable here. Okay, moving on to Horde Modes. I think in general defensive buffs are underrated in Horde modes. There aren't that many characters that have defensive buffs in the game, so it's nice to see the few that we do have. A lot of the times, especially things like LREs, can turn into real slug matches. It's just about surviving long enough to gradually grind everyone down, and Aesoth's defensive buff is really useful here. His active offers a little bit of crowd control, but I think where you really use him is defensively buffing other characters that are then going to handle the crowd control themselves. Super tanky unit, great in Horde modes. I will mention campaigns as well. If you have him leveled, he's actually got really quite a nice amount of synergy with the Octarius mirror, with the Octarius mirror units. Definitely don't level him just for this, but if you really like Custodius, you're leveling him anyway. Two of the Octarius mirror core units have non-normal attacks that would get Aesoth's damage buff. So Brother Bashard and God's Will. But in addition, if you're using Thorid as well, they're also getting extra hits on those non-normal attacks as well. So that kind of all combines together for a really nice damage buff. But in addition to that, you then get Aesoth's defensive bonus, which is really nice. And the stun can work really nicely on some of the campaign bosses as well. So I think he's a really nice kind of offbeat pick for Octarius Mirror. Definitely don't level him just for this though. It's just if you've got him leveled, I'd use him in this context. I've given him a B+ for Horde modes. Moving on to the fun category, I think Aesoth is a really well-designed character. Good job, Snowprint. They had a really clear kind of character identity in mind when they designed him, and they gave him a kit that really follows through on that as this kind of defensive, part defensive, part offensive buffer. I really like him. I think the Custodies in general are fun to play. Who doesn't like Golden Space Marines? And the natural synergy that he has with a bunch of other characters in the game, I think is really nice. I really enjoy him. I've given him a B for fun. I think he's great. How would I improve Aesoth? As I say, well-designed character that follows through on that has the kit that follows through on the character identity. I don't think he needs much improvement or changing. I like him as he is. If I was going to perhaps giving him a defensive relic or a relic that buffs his passive, I wouldn't want this to be game breaking. I think it's a bit boring if something's just, same idea but make the numbers bigger. But maybe you could decrease the pierce ratio of incoming damage, perhaps except for psychic damage. Or you could increase block chance of people within the radius. I think there's a few other ways that you can increase the defensive aspect of his passive, via a relic, without breaking the game, and in a more interesting way than just make the numbers bigger. So to summarise the entries for today, we've had Ulf and we've had Aesoth. Ulf, generally given him sort of slightly lower ratings here. I think he could do with a bit more improvement, perhaps make him a bit more raid focused specifically. Aesoth, I really like as a character, Bs across the board, just a kind of, even if not a top character, just a good entry into the game. So if you've watched all the way to the end, thank you very much. It does mean a lot when people are watching the content. Give me a comment down below. Let me know who you would like me to look at next time on the Heroes Gallery. As always, have a great day.